So we're nearly 48 hours out and the Iowa caucus debacle isn't even over yet. We only have 71% of the data reported in as I'm recording this. But what's made this all even worse is that by reporting the data partially, the Democratic Party has allowed Buttigieg and the neoliberal media to basically say that he's won over Bernie Sanders, when that's not necessarily the case for two key reasons. The first is that we don't have all the data, and given how close it is between Buttigieg and Sanders, it may well be the case that when all is said and done, whatever metric you use, Bernie Sanders could defeat Pete Buttigieg. But more than that, the way things are calculated in Iowa is so complex and multifaceted that you could very well say that Bernie Sanders may well be in the best position as we move beyond Iowa into other caucuses and primaries. So on the question of how you understand the Iowa results, there's 4 distinct numbers you need to understand. The first was the initial vote every person got from all of the individual caucuses. And there was about 1,700 of them. And at all of these caucuses, you stood with the person that you supported. The second vote were the votes taken after all of the reallocations. So if your person didn't have 15% in your particular caucus, you had the choice to move to another person to give them your second place support. And then there was another count. After that, those numbers are formulated into some kind of scheme that I'm not going to try to explain, which leads to a state delegate number. And then those state delegate numbers can be converted into the national delegate numbers. So if this is sounding absurd to you, you're not wrong, but that's how you understand the results. And what we see is that Bernie Sanders led through that first delegate count and that second delegate count. Bernie Sanders' lead over Pete Buttigieg shrunk from that first to second count, but by the end of the second count, Bernie Sanders still had more delegates than any other candidate in Iowa. And indeed, Bernie Sanders almost beat Pete Buttigieg's second count with his first, showing that by far, Bernie Sanders has the most first place support in Iowa. But because of where the votes are allocated and because of how this system works, Bernie Sanders has less statewide delegates than Pete Buttigieg. And that's the calculation people are using right now, at least, to basically give Pete Buttigieg the win, even though not all the results have been reported. But more important than those statewide delegates is understanding who actually wins the national delegates. Because statewide delegates are only a function of picking who goes to the national convention later on this year. And it's at the national convention where the nominee is actually chosen. So when you look at those numbers, Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg are effectively tied. They're both tied at 10 national delegates right now. That's the number that matters most of all. So I would suggest, and now this is my opinion here, that when those numbers are tied, the statewide delegates are effectively meaningless because they only serve that national delegate number. So what should matter more than statewide delegates when the national delegate total is tied is your actual ability to get first place support. Because in almost every other state, only some have caucuses, you can't cast more than one vote. You can only vote for one person. And the person you vote for is the one that gets your full support. Bernie Sanders clearly won the first ballot here in Iowa. And I would say that's a much better indicator of ongoing support and strength than statewide delegates, which are calculated by a BS arcane formula that no one understands, even some of the people doing the calculation, and includes things like coin flips to help decide edge cases, which means that it might not even be actually representative of the votes as they came in. But beyond this, it's good news for Bernie Sanders, what happened in Iowa in terms of the broad results. Pete Buttigieg being a strong first or second place candidate, depending on what happens when we get all the results, and Biden being in fourth or maybe even fifth behind Klobuchar is good news for Bernie Sanders. Because in the national polling, it's been a tight two-horse race lately between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And the feeling has been that Bernie Sanders could do very well in certain parts of the country, but the Joe Biden firewall in southern states where the black population is a little bit more moderate or conservative, they would go heavily in favor of Joe Biden. And that may still well be the case, but if Joe Biden truly is tanking, and he's doing way worse than his polling indicated in states like Iowa, it could well show that Joe Biden doesn't have the strength that the polling indicates. Meaning that in those southern states, Bernie Sanders may well be doing better vis-a-vis Joe Biden, which could help him earn delegates. And you might say that perhaps Pete Buttigieg's support nationally and in certain states has been underestimated since he did so well in Iowa, but I wouldn't necessarily be confident in saying that at this stage. Because one, Pete Buttigieg invested so much in trying to win Iowa, whereas Bernie Sanders is already adopting a broader approach. So Pete Buttigieg, if he didn't win Iowa, would be in a lot of trouble. He put all of his cards on the Iowa table and he laid them out. Maybe he's going to win, but that doesn't necessarily tell me that he's ready to win the other 49 states and the other caucuses and the other primaries. And further to all of that, Pete Buttigieg's national numbers are not great, especially with minorities. And if you're looking at where Joe Biden had a sort of edge over Bernie Sanders, it was among Southern black Democrats. But Bernie polls better with those populations than Pete Buttigieg does. And if Biden starts tanking and drops out, there's no guarantee those voters will move over to Buttigieg. They may well choose Bernie Sanders over Buttigieg, or they may well splinter into various camps, giving no one an advantage, but helping Bernie Sanders because he was the second place person behind Joe Biden in most of those southern states. So, this is good news for Bernie Sanders, unequivocally. You can say what you want to say about the narrative victory being given to Pete Buttigieg in Iowa, but we don't even know the full results. And as they stand, it's effectively a tie between Bernie and Buttigieg, and I'm giving Bernie the tiebreaker based on popular vote. But the consequences of Joe Biden severely underperforming his polling unequivocally benefits Bernie Sanders, and not necessarily Pete Buttigieg when it comes to scoring those non-white voters in the rest of the country. And it should be remembered that while Iowa is an overwhelmingly white state, the non-white populations of Iowa went strongly in favor of Bernie Sanders. He won a clear plurality, dominated the field among non-white Iowans. Again, small sample size, but perhaps a predictor of things to come, especially Bernie Sanders' strength among Latino and Latina Americans. So Bernie Sanders is still looking strong. I think he can make a credible case to have some sort of victory in Iowa, and he's clearly polling in first place in New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders has the momentum right now, and a Pete Buttigieg blip, if he even is winning in the first place, isn't going to be enough to stop that.